Imagine a wedding so scandalous, so invasive, that the bride's most private moments were judged not by her husband, but by an entire court. In medieval Europe, purity wasn't just personal, it was political, and every whisper, every gesture, every inch of flesh could determine the fate of kingdoms. Behind velvet curtains and sacred rituals, power, lust, and fear intertwined in a spectacle both horrifying and fascinating. This is a story of obedience forced, of authority unchecked, and of a young woman caught in a ritual designed to control not only her body, but the destiny of nations. Step inside the shadows of history, where the line between love, law, and cruelty was not just blurred, it was erased. In 1524, inside a glittering French court that reeked of incense and ego, a royal wedding was about to become a public crime scene of dignity. The bride was 17, the groom a prince, and every noble in Europe had come to witness what they called a holy union. But before vows or veils, the young bride had to prove something far more important than love her purity before the entire court. Because in the 16th century, a noble woman's body was political property. Virginity wasn't a virtue, it was evidence, and evidence demanded inspection. The church sanctified it, physicians verified it, and men with titles turned it into entertainment. What followed became the most humiliating wedding in recorded history, a ritual so obscene it made torture look dignified. Historians still debate which dynasty invented the practice, but by the early 1500s, every throne from Paris to Madrid had perfected it. A princess's body was an insurance policy for peace treaties. One rumor of defect could cancel alliances worth entire kingdoms. So rulers staged public confirmations of chastity, ceremonies wrapped in gold cloth and moral panic. That summer, France's heir, the Dauphin, was to marry a Savoyard princess whose education included Latin, etiquette, and terror. She'd been raised to kneel, smile, and obey. Now she was about to discover that obedience was her dowry. When the royal physicians arrived, escorted by bishops, matrons, and half the gossip network of Europe, the hall fell silent. What they called verification was really theater, a performance of power disguised as piety. Chroniclers, desperate to flatter the crown, wrote the phrase, "Her virtue was confirmed before witnesses." Translated, a terrified teenager was humiliated under the supervision of men who considered themselves civilized. The court applauded. The priests blessed the result. Musicians struck up hymns of thanksgiving. And the bride, now certified, was led to her gilded cage of a marriage. Within weeks, rumors spread faster than plague. Italian envoys mocked France's holy indecency. Spanish diplomats wrote home about a spectacle unfit for beasts. Instead of uniting empires, the event became Europe's favorite scandal, a grotesque reminder that purity had become performance art. To us, it sounds medieval madness, but to 16th century rulers, a woman's virginity was state security. If the bride wasn't intact, heirs could be challenged, bloodlines invalidated, wars reignited. Her body was literally the border between peace and chaos, and men defended that border with theology, bureaucracy, and surgical arrogance. No one recorded her words. History remembers her jewels, her dowry, her crest, but not her voice. She exists only as an object described by others. That absence is the evidence, the silence of the person most harmed. The chroniclers wrote pages on the feast that followed, but none on the tears that must have preceded it. Centuries later, moralists would rename these ordeals proofs of chastity, dressing barbarity in Latin. But stripped of ceremony, they were simply punishments for being born female, in a hierarchy terrified of women's autonomy. Every candlelit hall that hosted one became a monument to fear, fear of scandal, of illegitimacy, of losing control. And this anonymous bride, whoever she truly was, became the perfect symbol of that fear. Her humiliation wasn't an accident, it was policy. The ritual told every watching noblewoman exactly where power ended and obedience began. It said, "Your body belongs to the state before it belongs to you." The audience didn't gasp, they nodded. To them, it was justice. To us, it's pathology wearing pearls. When modern historians look back, they call it the politics of purity. But to the girl at the center of it, it was probably simpler. A lifetime of dread packed into 1 hour of exposure, followed by applause. The wedding feast that night glittered with music, jewels, and laughter, while the bride sat silent beside a husband she barely knew, Europe's newest alliance, signed in flesh. That was the true marriage ceremony of the 16th century. Not the vows at the altar, but the inspection beforehand. A state built on superstition had demanded proof that innocence could be measured, witnessed, and owned. And in that hall of gold and horror, one trembling bride proved nothing except how far power will go to make purity perform. In the glittering halls of medieval Europe, virginity wasn't just moral, it was political currency. Behind every royal wedding veil lurked a ledger of alliances, dowries, and bloodlines, all balanced precariously on a woman's chastity. Forget romance. Purity was policy, and one misplaced rumor could unravel an empire faster than any army. The church, of course, turned this obsession into gospel. From pulpits across Europe, priests thundered about the sanctity of untouched flesh, painting chastity as divine proof of worth. The Virgin Mary wasn't just a symbol of faith, she was a state-sponsored ideal, weaponized to keep noble daughters compliant. To be pure was to be valuable. To be spoiled was to be expendable. Every aristocratic father knew this, and every daughter paid the price. By the 14th and 15th centuries, purity had become a bureaucratic nightmare. In France, marriage contracts contained purity clauses requiring a bride to prove her virtue before the vows were even spoken. Families hired physicians to inspect, witnesses to attest, and priests to bless the process because apparently, God himself needed notarized confirmation of virginity. A single whisper of impropriety could nullify treaties and sink entire dynasties. A bride's body wasn't her own. It was collateral in the grand banking system of monarchy. And it wasn't just France. In England, wedding ceremonies turned consummation into public spectacle. Courtiers escorted the royal couple to the bedchamber, offered ceremonial prayers, and depending on the decade and the level of depravity, sometimes stayed to ensure completion. The following morning, the court awaited its proof, the blood-stained sheets triumphantly displayed like battle trophies. If the linen came back clean, panic followed. Councils convened, physicians were summoned, and gossip exploded across Europe faster than plague. This wasn't prudish morality, it was politics disguised as piety. A virgin bride guaranteed that the heirs of kings were legitimate. Her chastity preserved dynastic stability. Her body, a living contract ensuring no foreign seed, diluted the royal bloodline. Every drop of purity was a matter of national security. Consider Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, who married James IV of Scotland in 1503. Chroniclers celebrated her maidenly virtue, as if her womb alone secured peace between England and Scotland. But beneath the flattery was fear. Fear that if she wasn't pure, the alliance itself would crumble. And just a few decades later, her brother Henry weaponized that same paranoia to destroy Anne of Cleves. Claiming she wasn't a virgin, he annulled their marriage, humiliated her publicly, and shattered England's alliance with Germany. The failure wasn't military, it was marital. This fixation had roots in medieval science, which was more superstition than fact. Physicians, parroting Aristotle and Galen, insisted virginity could be visibly detected. They described the hymen as a holy seal, a divine stamp certifying a woman's untouched status. Never mind anatomy or consent, male scholars claimed authority over the unseen. And when their examinations failed, they simply blamed women for deceptive nature. In Spain, the case of Beatriz de Bobadilla in 1497 became infamous. Accused of being spoiled before marriage, her rivals demanded an examination. Doctors, likely terrified of contradicting powerful men, declared her impure. The verdict ended her betrothal, ruined her name, and drove her from court. Her reputation died not from sin, but from science pretending to be holy. That's how virginity became both moral theater and political insurance. Monarchs and bishops dressed it up as righteousness, but beneath the silk in scripture was raw control. Each ritual, each examination, each humiliating proof of purity was a performance staged to reassure men that power remained firmly in their hands. And yet the hypocrisy was staggering. Kings filled their palaces with mistresses, while demanding their brides arrive untouched. The church thundered about purity, while quietly forgiving any noble who paid enough gold. It wasn't about holiness, it was about ownership. So when you hear of the medieval obsession with virginity, remember, it wasn't faith that made men guard it so fiercely. It was fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of illegitimacy, fear that the women they married might hold even a shred of independence. Virginity wasn't a virtue, it was a cage lined with parchment, scripture, and politics. And for centuries, it was the only thing standing between a woman's crown and her ruin. History loves to dress tyranny in lace. Behind every royal wedding portrait, those solemn faces frozen in oil and gold, was a woman who never got to choose the hand that held hers. Our bride, the one soon to face the most humiliating ceremony in recorded history, was no different. She wasn't chosen for love, virtue, or charm. She was chosen because her family name fit neatly into a treaty. She was a chess piece, moved across Europe's blood-stained board, a symbol of unity between two nations that hated each other almost as much as they needed each other. The year was 1381, in the decaying heart of medieval France. The 100 Years' War had left kings bankrupt and nobles desperate. Peace, it seemed, could only be brokered through the body of a young woman. And so, a princess barely 16, raised on etiquette, prayer, and the quiet terror of duty, was offered as a sacrifice in silk. Her name was whispered in halls lined with heraldry, debated by men who treated her virtue like currency. To them, she wasn't a person. She was a peace treaty with a pulse. Her groom was decades older, a war-seasoned monarch known more for gout than gallantry. He'd already buried 2 wives and half his dignity. But he needed an heir, and more importantly, a connection to her powerful father. Their union was to be proof that France and Burgundy, 2 lions with locked jaws, could share a throne bed. The only question that mattered was whether the bride was worthy, and by worthy, they meant untouched. The court physicians were summoned, their credentials less medical than political. These were men whose livelihoods depended on pleasing kings, not healing patients. Their task? To verify that the princess was exactly as pure as the alliance required. The irony, of course, was thicker than the incense filling the chapel. Half the men demanding proof of her innocence had bastards scattered across the countryside. But hypocrisy was the bedrock of medieval politics. In the weeks before the wedding, rumors began to swirl through Paris like flies on a banquet table. Was the bride truly a virgin? Was her beauty exaggerated by desperate ambassadors? Did she limp? Was she too frail to bear children? None of these were moral questions, they were matters of policy. An unfit bride meant a broken treaty. And so the whispers grew until even the clergy joined in, drafting sermons about the sanctity of the womb, while secretly betting on whether the match would collapse. The princess herself said nothing, because silence was the only weapon she had. Every step she took toward her wedding day was choreographed by men who spoke of God while counting coin. Her dowry included jewels, lands, and a guarantee of obedience. The irony? Her consent was written by the same advisors who forbade her from reading the contract. She was a ghost in her own story. And yet, despite the theater of piety, the political stakes were brutal. If the marriage failed, France would lose Burgundy's armies. If it succeeded, the fragile peace might hold long enough to rebuild. The entire future of the realm rested on whether one terrified teenager satisfied the court's idea of perfection. That was medieval diplomacy in a nutshell. Bloodshed replaced by bedchambers, swords traded for ceremonies, and women reduced to test subjects in royal experiments. On the morning of her wedding, the streets of Paris erupted with feasts and fireworks. But inside the palace, tension reigned. The groom's advisors demanded that the examination be conducted before the vows to avoid, as one document put it, the scandal of a barren bed. The bride's entourage objected, citing modesty and decency. But modesty had no place in politics. The inspection would go forward, witnessed by physicians, priests, and nobles alike. A royal audience for the violation of privacy, all in the name of diplomacy. And so the stage was set. A court of 100 dignitaries prepared to judge one girl's virtue like farmers inspecting livestock. The most humiliating wedding in history wasn't a fluke, it was policy, written into the DNA of medieval power. To the men in brocade and velvet, this was duty. To the trembling bride, it was damnation wrapped in silk. She wasn't walking toward marriage. She was walking into a spectacle that would echo through centuries as the moment purity became politics, and politics became theater. If medieval politics had a favorite pastime, it wasn't war or hunting, it was humiliation, and nowhere was that spectacle more gloriously grotesque than in the royal marriage bed. The medieval elite could turn a private moment into a public festival faster than you can say, "God save the crown." Take, for example, the bedding ceremony, a charming custom designed to prove that two noble houses had truly united not in spirit, but in flesh. It began as a symbolic blessing, then devolved into one of the most bizarre and invasive traditions in European history. By the late 15th century, it was common practice for courtiers, priests, and physicians to witness the newlyweds' intimacy, or at least pretend to. This was not love. It was bureaucracy wrapped in bed linens. The church justified it as a guarantee of legitimacy. After all, if a queen bore a child who might one day inherit the throne, the realm needed proof that the child was truly royal. In an era obsessed with lineage, fertility was policy, and nothing was left to faith. A monarch's wedding night became a matter of state. Chroniclers described entire courts waiting outside the royal chamber, ready to record the details like accountants of morality. In 1423, for instance, when Margaret of Anjou married Henry VI of England, witnesses followed the newlyweds to their chamber. Priests chanted blessings while attendants undressed the couple, undressed them to the sound of hymns. Once the royal pair were tucked into bed, the curtains were drawn, and the room cleared. Outside, nobles toasted the occasion, confident that God and government had just merged beneath the sheets. The ceremony ended with the court's declaration that the marriage had been consummated in the eyes of the realm. Whether it actually had been, didn't matter. The paperwork said yes, and that was enough for history. But the practice wasn't confined to England. Across the Channel, the French court elevated it into theater. During the marriage of Louis XII and Mary Tudor in 1514, witnesses entered the bridal chamber carrying torches, observing as the king climbed into bed with his teenage bride. The chronicler, Edward Hall, wrote with chilling casualness, "The curtains were drawn and all departed, having seen enough." Enough of what exactly he didn't specify, and perhaps it was better that way. For the women involved, these ceremonies were less about faith and more about surveillance. Their bodies were contracts, their discomfort was collateral. A blushing bride wasn't shy, she was evidence being processed. And heaven helped the queen who didn't produce heirs fast enough. When Anne of Austria struggled to conceive with Louis XIII, the French clergy debated whether their marriage had been properly joined. A doctor was dispatched to inspect the royal bedding, as though a failed pregnancy were a clerical error. Even the king's masculinity came under suspicion, proving that no one, not even royalty, escaped the microscope of medieval morality. It's tempting to dismiss all this as distant barbarism, but the obsession with policing women's purity never really vanished. The ceremony of shame simply changed costumes. In the 18th century, courts replaced beds with doctors' tables. In the 19th, it was medical virginity exams performed under the guise of science. In the 20th, the language softened to tests of chastity, but the purpose remained identical: to prove that a woman's worth could still be certified by others. In medieval chronicles, these rituals were described with reverence. Today, they read like horror. The same historians who condemned heresy and blasphemy wrote with near ecstatic detail about the bedding of queens. They recorded what she wore, who watched, what hymns were sung, everything except what she thought. That silence, more than anything, is the legacy of these ceremonies. It tells us what medieval society truly valued: not love, not faith, not even peace, but control. So when a chronicler calls a wedding magnificent, remember what that meant. Trumpets, jewels, blessings, and a crowd gathered outside the royal bed. waiting for the kingdom's future to begin with the pull of a curtain. The ceremony wasn't just about proving purity. It was about reminding every subject, every noble, and every woman exactly who owned that purity. If you've ever wondered how medieval nobles managed to be both bored and depraved at the same time, here's your answer. When war wasn't entertaining enough, when hunting lost its thrill, the royal court turned to a new pastime, watching. Watching their kings, watching their queens, and most disturbingly, watching their weddings. To modernize, it's madness. To the medieval elite, it was tradition. Public observation was legitimacy. If the court didn't see it, it might as well not have happened. So the same people who spent mornings judging heretics and afternoons gossiping about who smelled like plague, spent their evenings peeking into royal bedchambers under the sacred banner of duty. No one embodied this better than the Valois and Bourbon courts of 15th century France, where ceremony was obsession and privacy was a myth. Courtiers bore witness to every royal milestone from birth to death, and everything awkwardly in between. They attended meals, prayers, and medical treatments, and yes, wedding nights. The king's body belonged to the realm, and so did his bride's. The health of the kingdom depended on both, and the court made sure everything worked as advertised. When Louis XII of France married Mary Tudor in 1514, dozens of nobles were invited to watch them go to bed. Chroniclers claim the king, in his 50s and visibly ill, joked about his stamina. Courtiers laughed nervously as they ushered him toward the bed, like attendants escorting a prized racehorse. When he died just 3 months later, rumors exploded that Mary's youth had exhausted him. The court that once cheered his virility now whispered about his weakness. No humiliation was too sacred for gossip. In England, voyeurism became policy. The Tudor court thrived on scandal, and no one weaponized it better than Henry VIII. When doubts arose about Catherine of Aragon's virginity after her first marriage, the court staged interrogations that bordered on theater. Nobles and clerics debated what consummation truly meant, as if it were a theological riddle. Henry used those whispers decades later to justify his annulment, proving that what the court saw or claimed to see could rewrite history. Voyeurism wasn't merely entertainment, it was politics. To be a courtier was to observe, record, and comment. Power demanded an audience, and that audience demanded intimacy. Behind every throne stood a crowd of witnesses, ready to interpret every gesture and rumor. Under their gaze, personal lives became public property. It's easy to picture these nobles as jeweled voyeurs clutching goblets behind tapestries, but many saw their presence as sacred duty. To witness was to affirm truth. To affirm truth was to preserve order. Reputation became reality. The queen who smiled too little was cold. The one who smiled too much was impure. The king who prayed alone was pious. The one who didn't invite observers was suspect. Even the palaces themselves reflected this obsession. Royal chambers were built like stages, rooms within rooms, each designed for visibility. The king's bedchamber wasn't a sanctuary. It was a performance hall. Curtains replaced walls. Courtiers replaced privacy. And rumors replaced history. And of course, all this voyeurism came with a cost paid mostly by women. Queens were watched, tested, and discussed in ways kings never were. A monarch's body was divine. A queen's body was evidence. If she bled, conceived, or failed to conceive, the court noticed. If she stumbled at a ceremony, whispers of bad omens followed her. Power had eyes, and those eyes never blinked. By the late 16th century, a few monarchs began to rebel against this grotesque theater. Elizabeth I turned voyeurism into propaganda. If they were going to watch, she'd decide what they saw. Her unmarried body became a weaponized symbol of divine virginity, a calculated performance that mocked the very system that created it. But for most queens before her, the court's gaze was a curse. To be royal was to live surrounded by witnesses never loved, only studied. Their lives weren't fairy tales. They were autopsies performed in public. Because in the medieval imagination, the crown was sacred, but privacy was sin. And the court, ever faithful, made sure sin was impossible. If there was one institution that could turn humiliation into holiness. It was the medieval church. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the clergy had perfected the art of sanctifying shame. Every royal wedding, no matter how political or personal, was wrapped in layers of divine theater. Purity wasn't just a virtue, it was a performance endorsed by heaven itself. And behind that theater stood the church, smiling benevolently, holding a Bible in one hand and a ledger in the other. To understand why the church blessed some of the most humiliating rituals in history, you have to understand what purity meant and how profitable it was. In a world where politics and religion were conjoined twins, a virgin bride wasn't merely a woman, she was divine property. Her untouched body symbolized God's favor, her obedience His will. If she failed to appear pure, the entire union risked being tainted politically, morally, and spiritually. It was the clergy who built the theology that made this obsession possible. Church fathers like Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas declared virginity the ultimate moral currency. Sex, even within marriage, was a concession to weakness. Virginity, by contrast, was perfection, the closest mortals could come to angelic purity. Conveniently, that teaching handed the church enormous power. Only priests could declare a marriage valid, and only priests could determine whether purity had been preserved. By the 15th century, the Catholic Church had woven virginity into royal politics. Papal envoys and bishops were dispatched to verify the chastity of noble brides. Religious rhetoric cloaked every inspection, turning invasive scrutiny into divine duty. The priest became both moral judge and political referee, a man who could bless an alliance or destroy it with a single accusation. One infamous case came in 1486, when Anne of Brittany was betrothed to Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor. The couple never met, yet Anne's chastity became a European concern. When France later forced her to marry Charles VIII, priests publicly declared her pure and untainted. That ritual wasn't for heaven's sake, it was propaganda. Her virtue, notarized by clergy, legitimized France's annexation of Brittany. The church understood spectacle. A wedding wasn't just a union, it was propaganda wrapped in incense. Priests officiated like stage directors, reciting Latin blessings while courtiers and commoners alike watched in awe. The bride's silence, her downcast eyes, her folded hands, all were part of the choreography. Modesty wasn't a virtue, it was a script. And while the church condemned lust from the pulpit, it never forgot to monetize it. Weddings were lucrative. Every papal dispensation, annulment, and ceremonial blessing came with a fee. Purity, it turned out, was divine business, a way to sell morality by the ounce. The obsession didn't stop at queens. Ordinary women lived under the same moral microscope. Theologians called women's bodies gateways of sin, their purity a fragile defense against corruption. Even nuns weren't exempt. Monastic chronicles recorded countless tests of sanctity, invasive, humiliating, and cloaked in religious devotion. If a woman failed to appear chaste in behavior, rumor, or appearance, her reputation, and sometimes her life, could be destroyed. For the clergy, purity became both obsession and weapon. It allowed them to regulate women's bodies while preaching divine authority. They could invalidate marriages, legitimize kings, or condemn queens, all in God's name. When the church declared a bride pure, it wasn't theology, it was politics in robes. When it condemned a queen, it wasn't morality, it was control. And yet the hypocrisy was breathtaking. Popes fathered children, bishops kept mistresses, and priests who thundered about chastity routinely broke their vows. The higher the sermon, the lower the practice. But no one dared question them, because questioning meant risking your soul. In the end, divine blessing and public humiliation became indistinguishable. The church didn't just bless marriages, it choreographed them, branded them, and profited from them. A bride's virtue was the ticket price, and everyone from pope to peasant had a front row seat. Because in medieval Europe, purity wasn't holiness. It was politics baptized in holy water, and the church made sure everyone said amen. By the late 15th century, the human body had become a battlefield, and the doctors were its generals. Every inch of royal flesh was a matter of state, every blemish a potential scandal. But medicine, as the court practiced it, wasn't science. It was theater in Latin. The leading actors weren't healers, but courtiers with medical degrees, eager to prove loyalty by examining truth itself, often through the bodies of women who had no say. Court doctors didn't treat illness so much as they treated anxiety, the monarchy's terror of weakness. A fainting spell, a pale complexion, a missed period, each could spark a political crisis. Physicians were summoned not to heal the body, but to diagnose the stability of the throne. Was the king virile? Was the queen fertile? Was the heir legitimate? These weren't medical questions. They were existential ones. Nowhere was this clearer than in France under Charles VIII and Louis XII. Their physicians, trained at the University of Paris, called themselves men of science, yet their methods looked more like gossip with anatomy props. They mixed astrology with alchemy, scripture with superstition, and called it medicine. Their examinations were performances where anatomy served politics. When a queen failed to conceive, a doctor's report could destroy alliances, rewrite treaties, even justify wars. The royal physician wasn't a servant, but a gatekeeper of truth. To examine the queen was to interpret the will of God, or at least the will of the king. These men held terrifying power. They could declare a woman sound or unfit, pure or corrupted, with the authority of both science and scripture behind them. And like all power in medieval courts, that authority was bought, traded, and performed before an audience. Take Margaret of Austria in 1497. Betrothed to Spain's Prince Juan, she was examined by physicians to confirm her fitness to bear heirs. The verdict? Favorable, meaning politically convenient. When Juan died months later, whispers claimed her body had drained his vitality. The same doctors who praised her purity now hinted at hidden flaws. In this theater of flesh, women could never win, and the doctors weren't alone. Bishops, ambassadors, and nobles often stood by as witnesses. Their presence ensured transparency, though it really ensured humiliation. Every diagnosis was propaganda in parchment form. A queen's health, a princess's chastity, a royal couple's intimacy, all reduced to paperwork, stamped with royal seals and ecclesiastical approval. Medicine was supposed to heal, but in palaces, it became surveillance. The physician's quill was as sharp as any sword. One report could preserve a dynasty, another could doom it. And since most doctors were financed by noble patrons, their findings conveniently aligned with whoever paid them. Truth, like purity, had a price tag. By the 16th century, some courts even appointed medical witnesses to royal marriages. These men, often more political than medical, were tasked with confirming a bride's readiness and a groom's ability. Science became ritual. Ritual became control. And while the church blessed the unions, it was the doctors who notarized them. Universities reinforced this obsession. In Padua, Montpellier, and Paris, students learned not to cure, but to classify. Women's bodies were dissected in theory, never in empathy. The female form was treated as a divine riddle, a puzzle meant to test man's intellect and confirm his authority. Doctors wrote volumes on chastity, menstruation, and fertility, yet few had ever spoken to a woman outside confession. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the court physician had evolved into a hybrid creature, half scientist, half spy. He read pulses the way ambassadors read treaties. Every symptom was evidence, every diagnosis a declaration of loyalty. His stethoscope, if he'd had one, would have been shaped like a crown. In the gilded halls of Europe, medicine lost its soul. The pursuit of knowledge gave way to the preservation of power. Doctors claimed to serve health, but what they truly served was hierarchy, the politics of flesh, wrapped in white linen and sanctified by gold. Because in royal courts, even science bowed before the throne, and the human body, especially the queen's, was never her own. If there's one thing medieval Europe loved more than holiness, it was a good show, preferably one involving humiliation, incense, and a royal title. Medicine, religion, and gossip were so tightly entwined that the difference between a diagnosis and a drama was often just the size of the audience. What the church and crown called examination was, in truth, performance, a morality play, where flesh became scripture and science became spectacle. The stage was the royal court, dripping with velvet and hypocrisy. Physicians, bishops, and noblemen gathered like judges in some divine tribunal, quills ready to record history's most intimate absurdities. The justification was always noble: the health of the monarchy, the sanctity of marriage, the purity of the realm. But the reality was voyeurism in formal robes. The same hands that turned the pages of Scripture also turned public curiosity into state ritual. The idea that a woman's body could symbolize the stability of a kingdom made these medical inspections irresistible to both church and state. They weren't confirming fertility, they were confirming legitimacy, as if the womb itself were a royal charter. And because legitimacy demanded witnesses, the private chamber became a stage, and the woman queen, duchess, or unfortunate bride became unwilling theater. Records from the 15th and 16th centuries are full of these grotesque ceremonies. When doubts surrounded a royal marriage, doctors were summoned to verify its completion. The language was medical, the intent was political. In 1499, when Louis XII sought to annul his marriage to Joan of France, physicians testified she was unfit for conjugal life. Joan, a pious and deformed woman, was humiliated publicly in what should have been a sacred matter. The examination became courtroom theater, one that ended with her discarded, while the doctors left richer and more respected. Across Europe, the same script repeated. In Spain, the Habsburgs turned medicine into diplomacy. When Princess Juana of Portugal married Prince John, physicians and bishops documented the royal couple's compatibility in chilling detail. Their reports circulated among ambassadors, who interpreted anatomy like political scripture. In England, Henry VIII's court industrialized humiliation, with theologians and doctors performing intellectual gymnastics to decide whether Catherine of Aragon's first marriage had been consummated. Every argument disguised as theology was, at its core, theater, the kind that decided the fate of queens. Even commoners were dragged into the spectacle. Public dissections, first introduced in Italian universities, were billed as educational but sold as entertainment. Students and nobles crowded the halls of Bologna and Padua to watch men in black robes slice open corpses under candlelight, narrating their findings like priests reciting scripture. The audience gasped, professors pontificated, and somewhere beneath it all, human dignity quietly bled away. The line between science and showmanship disappeared, leaving medicine as little more than organized voyeurism. Royal courts borrowed that same format, except their subjects were alive. A queen's fertility, a duchess's virginity, a bride's fitness, all paraded beneath chandeliers and crucifixes. The church offered blessings, physicians Latin jargon, and courtiers applause. The justification was simple: God sees all. Conveniently, so did everyone else. This was not ignorance, it was design. Public scrutiny reinforced authority. The more people watched, the more power the watchers gained. Monarchs and priests alike understood that humiliation could be molded into proof of divine order. If a queen endured inspection with grace, she embodied obedience. If she resisted, she embodied sin. Either way, the system won. And it worked. These rituals gave legitimacy to monarchies, credibility to physicians, and revenue to the church. To challenge them was to question God, science, and the crown all at once, a trinity of control few dared to oppose. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the line between healer and herald was gone. Doctors announced their findings in letters read aloud to courts, turning private bodies into public archives. The more sacred the body, the greater the audience. What had once been an act of medicine had become a ceremony of dominance, dressed in the language of reason. In the end, it wasn't medicine that evolved, it was spectacle. The scalpel became a scepter, the examination a sermon, and humiliation a kind of ritual purification. The church called it sanctity. The doctors called it science. The court called it order. But history remembers it for what it truly was: a public spectacle disguised as medicine, and everyone, it seemed, wanted a front row seat. In medieval Europe, the royal bed was never simply furniture. It was a courtroom, a stage, and often a battlefield. Its linens bore witness to the most intimate and politically explosive ritual of all, the consummation of marriage. While villagers could wed quietly and move on, monarchs could not. Their unions were national business, their bodies instruments of dynastic proof, and legitimacy demanded witnesses, written reports, and frequently ecclesiastical ceremony. Sweat, stains, and testimony replaced intimacy with scrutiny, and the slightest misstep could ripple into scandal, war, or dynastic crisis. The bedchamber became a theater of authority, where dynasties were secured, alliances confirmed, and dignity publicly dismantled. In a world where divine right justified crowns, sexual unions required oversight from God's earthly representatives, bishops to bless the rite, courtiers to bear witness, and physicians to record signs who interpreted the human body as both legal evidence and spiritual testimony. What began as a symbolic testament to piety evolved into one of the most humiliating forms of political theater Europe ever staged, a ritual spectacle draped in velvet, incense, and hypocrisy. The euphemism public bedding masked a blunt reality, state surveillance masquerading as ceremony. After vows were exchanged, couples were escorted to beds prepared for inspection. Curtains might obscure vision, but the audience listened, judged, and recorded every sound. When the act was declared complete, evidence was scrutinized: sheets, linens, occasionally garments, or the parties themselves. This grotesque procedure was not an oddity, but a courtly norm, and no realm refined it more skillfully than France. In 1533, the marriage of Henry, Duke of Orleans, and Catherine de' Medici presented the ritual in full pageant. Priests blessed linens, nobles whispered wagers, and a private union became public performance. England elevated the practice into bureaucratic obsession. When Mary Tudor married Philip II of Spain in 1554, English and Spanish courtiers produced separate written reports on the bedding to ensure both crowns could claim the alliance had been sealed. The next morning, sheets might be displayed to ambassadors as legal proof. Failure to produce the proper marks could spark rumors, lawsuits, or diplomatic crises. For royalty, virginity was verification, not merely virtue. Henry VIII's court turned the custom into a tyrannical obsession. Catherine of Aragon's marital history was dissected by theologians, arguing about consummation as if it were a legal quibble. Anne of Cleves was discarded after Henry deemed her body unsatisfactory. In the Tudor world, consummation became governance. Private acts were repurposed as public proof, and a king's grievance could recalibrate alliances and succession in an instant. The church codified the spectacle. Bishops authored manuals describing what counted as proof, visible signs, bodily warmth, and traces of exertion terms that read like forensic checklists. In one notorious account, a physician reported bruises as evidence of consummation. In another, midwives testified at councils about the state of linens. Clergy who thundered against lust, nevertheless, authored the very paperwork that turned intimacy into legal evidence. Ambassadors wrote dispatches summarizing bedding reports, chancery clerks filed them into state archives, and foreign courts used such records as bargaining chips proof that could break treaties or legitimize heirs. Sometimes the ritual tipped into farce. Burgundian poets mocked bedding ceremonies. Courtiers composed double entendres about royal prowess. Gossip spread faster than plague. The bed became a column in the court gazette, its sheets headline news. Yet beneath the jokes lay a harsh reality. These performances stripped women of agency. A spotless sheet could ruin reputations and realms. A stained one could stabilize alliances. Brides were reduced to proof, texts, their bodies archived in chancery. Over time, public bedding retreated into documentation and diplomatic discretion, but its logic endured. Legitimacy remained tied to surveillance, and power continued to be measured against bodies rather than consent. Monarchs traded linen for headlines, but the principle that private bodies could be public evidence persisted. Medieval courts wrapped the practice in ceremony and scripture, but the message was blunt. Truth required witnesses. Modern historians call these rituals a brutal blend of law, religion, and theater, a reminder of how thoroughly power can claim the human body. Nothing, however sacred, escaped examination. The church called it divine order. The court called it tradition. History calls it what it was: the royal bed, the original stage for Europe's most indecent performance. In medieval Europe, virginity was not merely a personal trait. It was a political instrument, a religious symbol, and often a ticket to power. The stakes were enormous. A bride's purity could determine dynastic succession, secure alliances, or even ignite war. It is no wonder, then, that the obsession with verifying virginity led to a series of grotesque and, at times, catastrophic errors. These were not merely embarrassing mistakes, they were public spectacles with consequences that could ruin reputations, destabilize kingdoms, and humiliate women in ways that echoed for decades. The logic behind virginity tests was as flawed as it was invasive. Physicians, midwives, and occasionally clerics were called upon to inspect the bride's body, to certify her chastity before she entered the royal bed. Methods ranged from palpation to visual inspection, sometimes including the infamous two-finger test, and always under the guise of medical or religious necessity. In reality, these assessments were subjective, rife with personal bias, and astonishingly fallible. And yet, a failed test could be treated as incontrovertible evidence of moral, political, or spiritual failure. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in the late 15th century at the French court. Charlotte of Savoy, betrothed to a high-ranking noble, underwent the customary inspection. The court-appointed physicians pronounced her imperfectly pure, though contemporary accounts suggest they were influenced more by political rivalry than physical evidence. The verdict was catastrophic. Charlotte's marriage was postponed, her dowry questioned, and rumors circulated that she had dishonored her family. Only years later did chroniclers note that the physician's measurements had likely been misread, a tragic misjudgment in a culture that demanded absolute certainty. Mistakes were not confined to France. In Spain, the case of Princess Juana of Castile highlights how errors in judgment could shape history. Known posthumously as Juana la Loca, her marriage to Philip the Handsome required verification of virginity, a requirement imposed by the Habsburg court. Doctors and midwives initially reported anomalies, later clarified as harmless variations of anatomy. Yet the initial rumor fueled gossip, casting Juana's loyalty and character into doubt. The court's obsession with proof contributed to the paranoia that would later define her reputation and justify political restrictions on her autonomy. Even the methods themselves were often disastrous. Instruments intended to assist in examinations were crude, unsanitary, and sometimes dangerous. Mistakes could cause real physical harm, leading to infections, bleeding, and trauma. In certain documented cases, women were physically injured during inspections, and the blame fell entirely on their bodies rather than the incompetent or unscrupulous examiners. In a society where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to pass a test she did not control, these accidents were treated as moral failings rather than medical errors. The consequences extended beyond the individual. A failed virginity test could destabilize diplomatic negotiations, trigger annulments, or provide rivals with justification to challenge succession. In 1514, the marriage of a young princess in Burgundy faced scrutiny not for her character, but because foreign envoys demanded evidence of her chastity. A misinterpreted examination nearly resulted in a diplomatic crisis, only averted through intervention by multiple clerics and physicians, a dramatic example of how flawed medical assessments could ripple through political spheres. The absurdity of the tests did not escape contemporary observers. Satirical poems, chronicles, and letters mocked the procedure, highlighting its invasive nature and the human tendency to project political fears onto private bodies. Yet mockery rarely prevented harm. Social and political pressures outweighed both reason and ethics. The bride's body was the proof required by kings, bishops, and diplomats alike, and failure, real or imagined, was a punishment in itself. Ultimately, these errors exposed the dangerous intersection of power, medicine, and morality. Virginity tests, presented as instruments of truth, were deeply unreliable, yet they carried consequences that were brutally real. Women paid the price of fallible judgment, and courts demonstrated that even sacred institutions could be instruments of public humiliation. When virginity tests went wrong, the repercussions were felt not just by the bride, but by dynasties, nations, and history itself, a grim testament to the cost of measuring human worth by flawed standards. By the late medieval period, Europe had amassed a curious paradox, an obsession with knowledge about the human body, paired with a staggering inability to understand it. What courtiers, doctors, and clergy proudly called science was often ignorance masquerading as expertise, sanctioned by authority and cloaked in Latin, ritual, and spectacle. In the context of royal marriages, this ignorance was particularly destructive, for the stakes were nothing less than dynastic legitimacy, political alliances, and the social order itself. The science of ignorance, as it came to be practiced, transformed curiosity into cruelty, observation into oppression, and the human body, especially the female body, into a site of political theater. Medical texts from the 14th and 15th centuries reveal a worldview governed as much by superstition as by fact. Anatomists wrote volumes on fertility, menstruation, and virginity, yet few had ever interacted with a living woman outside the confessional. Students were trained to classify bodies theoretically, to measure hymens and predict childbearing potential, but practical experience was scarce. Observation was filtered through expectation. A body could not fail to conform to ideology. If the evidence conflicted with doctrine, the error was blamed on the body, not the observer. Royal courts were laboratories of this so-called knowledge. Physicians equipped with dubious instruments, arcane charts, and a performative confidence were tasked with verifying brides' virginity, diagnosing fertility, or assessing the king's vigor. These were not simple medical consultations. They were examinations under duress, often conducted before audiences of dignitaries, clerics, and sometimes entire courts. The science at play was less about understanding human physiology than about legitimizing political narratives. A queen's body could confirm an alliance or justify annulment. A princess's hymen could decide whether a kingdom would be inherited peacefully or fall into conflict. The most infamous examples came from France and Spain, where courts institutionalized observation as policy. Physicians performed intricate inspections of young brides, measuring, prodding, and recording every detail, as if human tissue were a legal document. Yet, the instruments were crude, knowledge incomplete, and the methods entirely subjective. In many cases, errors were inevitable. Misreading an anatomical feature could label a woman impure, lead to annulments, or provoke scandal. And because authority royal, ecclesiastical, and medical converged, these errors were rarely questioned. A queen might be innocent of any fault, yet her reputation could crumble under the weight of an expert report. This science extended to fertility as well. Doctors attempted to predict childbearing potential through urine, pulses, and visual inspection. Astrology, humor theory, and Galenic medicine dictated conclusions. If a woman failed to conceive, it was assumed she was defective. If a man was impotent, rumor or medical report could erase legitimacy. The science was absurd, yet its consequences were brutally real. Annulments, political maneuvering, imprisonment, and sometimes exile. Ignorance, when authorized and performed theatrically, became a tool of power. Universities across Europe contributed to this phenomenon. Lectures in Padua, Montpellier, and Paris encouraged students to memorize anatomical theories while discouraging practical empathy or critical observation. The female body became an abstraction, a puzzle of sin, biology, and morality. Texts rationalized invasive examinations as necessary to preserve dynasties, but they were nothing more than codified ignorance dressed as knowledge. Students left halls of learning convinced they understood the body, yet most conclusions were guesses justified by authority. Even the church embraced this science. Clerics provided moral frameworks that intersected with medical speculation, turning flawed assessments into theological judgments. A misinterpreted hymen or missed menstruation became evidence of sin, validated by both scripture and physicians' notes. The convergence of religion, politics, and medicine amplified error, producing an apparatus of humiliation that treated conjecture as truth. By the Renaissance, some methods evolved, but the logic of authority remained. Knowledge had grown, instruments had improved, yet human bodies, particularly women's, were still sites where ignorance ruled and power triumphed. The science of ignorance was never merely academic. It was a mechanism of control, a spectacle of judgment, and a reminder that even the most ostentatious pursuit of knowledge could become tyranny. In the end, medieval Europe celebrated the illusion of understanding while punishing the vulnerable for its failures. The royal court, the physician, and the church, all institutions claiming insight, proved time and again that certainty was dangerous, observation deceptive, and human bodies, especially female, perilously exposed to the science of ignorance. By the 16th century, the grotesque rituals surrounding royal brides had spread far beyond France, England, and Spain, becoming a template for courts across Europe. What began as an obsession of a few monarchs had evolved into a predictable spectacle: the examination of virginity, the policing of modesty, and the transformation of intimacy into political theater. This was no longer confined to a single kingdom or dynasty. It had become a pan-European phenomenon, a social contagion that blended power, paranoia, and performance. The humiliation ritual, once rare and scandalous, became a normalized instrument of authority, sanctioned by custom, medicine, and church. The mechanisms of dissemination were surprisingly efficient. Ambassadors carried reports of royal ceremonies to their courts. Chroniclers documented the rituals for posterity. Physicians, trained in the same universities, carried standardized methods of inspection. In Venice, the court of the Doge borrowed from French precedents, insisting on witnesses to marriages and public examinations of prospective brides' virtue. Italian city-states, keen on maintaining alliances and controlling succession, incorporated the spectacle as part of their own elaborate civic rituals. Every performance reinforced the belief that a woman's body was evidence and a stage, her dignity subordinate to the state. The Habsburgs turned the ritual into a highly bureaucratic affair. Marriages arranged for diplomacy often involved multiple examinations, performed not just by physicians, but also by theologians and noble representatives. Reports were written, copied, and filed like legal documents. They were circulated to foreign courts and consulted before treaties were finalized. Virginity became codified into policy, and any deviation, real or imagined, could trigger scandal, annulment, or international tension. In such a world, the bride was never merely a person. She was an instrument, a symbol, and sometimes a pawn in literal wars of legitimacy. The psychological toll on these women cannot be overstated. From Paris to Prague, brides were stripped of agency and autonomy under the guise of propriety. The examination rituals, performed under supervision of medical, religious, and political authorities, transformed the bedroom into a stage of intimidation. Public pressure reinforced private fear. The bride's compliance was interpreted as proof of virtue. Resistance was evidence of sin. Even the most discreet woman could not escape the gaze of a court, determined to witness what was, in reality, no one else's business. In England, the Tudor obsession intensified the spectacle. The annulment of Henry VIII's marriages, Catherine of Aragon, Anne of Cleves, was facilitated through a combination of voyeuristic examinations, doctored testimonies, and scholarly opinion. Henry's court industrialized humiliation, making virginity tests, fertility evaluations, and intimate scrutiny not just ritual, but legal and political necessity. Courtiers learned quickly. Participation ensured favor. Objection could mean disgrace or exile. Observation became both entertainment and instrument of control. In Eastern Europe, similar patterns emerged. Polish and Bohemian courts adopted variants of the ritual, using it to assert dynastic legitimacy and ensure obedience to monarchs. The lessons traveled through marriages, treaties, and alliances. Physicians and clerics educated in one kingdom carried the same methods to others, enforcing uniformity in humiliation across borders. The act of witnessing, once a single courtly indulgence, had become a continent-wide expectation. Even ordinary women were affected indirectly. Nobility across Europe emulated court practices, enforcing virginity and virtue as public obligations. The surveillance extended into daily life. Dowries, reputations, and marriage contracts were shaped by fears of impurity, scandal, and observation. A bride's body was no longer her own. It was a public ledger, her reputation a commodity measured in front of witnesses. By the late 16th century, the humiliation ritual had achieved its zenith. It was embedded in law, custom, and expectation. Across courts from Madrid to Vienna, the performance of purity, the examination of bodies, and the public sanctioning of virtue became normalized. The ritual spread not because it was moral, rational, or just, but because it reinforced hierarchy, spectacle, and control. In the end, the humiliation ritual was more than a ceremony. It was a social technology. It taught obedience, legitimized authority, and converted private intimacy into a public event. And as it spread across Europe, it carried with it a simple, cruel lesson. In the courts of kings, a woman's body was never her own. In the historical record, the bride is almost always absent. Chronicles, letters, and court reports focus on kings, diplomats, physicians, and priests. But the woman at the center of the spectacle is often reduced to a footnote, a set of observations, or a sheet of evidence. Yet imagining the bride's perspective reveals a story of fear, shame, and resilience. A human being thrust into a ritual designed to strip her of autonomy, dignity, and privacy. Her body, her honor, her future, every aspect of her existence was subject to public scrutiny, and her voice was rarely permitted to interrupt the narrative. To be a royal bride in medieval Europe was to live in a cage gilded with velvet and gold. Before the marriage even began, she was measured, examined, and compared against a checklist of virtue, chastity, and compliance. Physicians, clergy, and courtiers approached her like an object to be certified, rather than a person to be loved. Every movement she made was interpreted as evidence of morality. Every hesitation or blush risked condemnation. The bride's world was one of constant observation, where even silence could be weaponized against her. Imagine the anxiety, walking into a chapel, knowing that the eyes of nobles and bishops were assessing not only her behavior, but also her future fertility and political utility. Even the wedding gown, intended to symbolize purity, functioned as armor against scrutiny. Her modesty, ritualized, was performance. The way she lowered her eyes, folded her hands, or curtsied could be recorded as proof of virtue or weakness. In many ways, the bride was both spectator and spectacle, a participant in a play whose script she did not write. The consummation of marriage, the most intimate act imaginable, was the ultimate betrayal of privacy. In courts across France, England, Spain, and beyond, the bed was transformed into evidence, and the bride into a reluctant performer. Curtains might separate the participants from the crowd, but the knowledge that her actions were being monitored, judged, and later reported created a suffocating atmosphere. Fear, anxiety, and humiliation were constant companions. What should have been an act of personal connection became an instrument of politics, and the bride's consent was irrelevant to those wielding power. Pain was not only physical, but emotional. Reports of examinations often described the bride as trembling, fainting, or forced to endure procedures that were invasive, degrading, and sometimes medically unnecessary. Even when physicians or clerics acted under the guise of science or religion, the bride experienced it as coercion. Her body was not her own. It was territory to be surveyed, verified, and sometimes weaponized in the pursuit of alliances, inheritance, or dynastic survival. Despite these pressures, many brides developed strategies of subtle resistance. Compliance could coexist with quiet defiance, a look, a hesitation, a word withheld. Some cultivated patience and endurance, surviving the ritualized humiliation by understanding the audience, the stakes, and the rituals. Others used intelligence and charm to navigate the treacherous web of courtly observation, turning scrutiny into a means of survival. The bride's perspective, though muted in official sources, often reflects extraordinary psychological resilience. At times, historical letters and memoirs hint at the bride's inner world: anxiety over public perception, grief over the loss of privacy, or fear for personal safety. In a society where reputation was paramount, even minor missteps could provoke rumor, shame, or worse. She lived in a dual reality, a private self trapped behind a public performance. Her body, her virtue, and her choices were contested spaces, yet she had to move through them with grace, diplomacy, and endurance. Ultimately, the bride's perspective illuminates the human cost of political ritual. While courts celebrated purity, power, and legitimacy, the women at the center endured fear, coercion, and invisibility. They were not merely participants in dynastic politics, they were living, feeling witnesses to their own exploitation. Their stories, often unrecorded, remind us that behind every historical spectacle, there was a person experiencing terror, confusion, and courage in equal measure. In the end, the bride's perspective forces us to confront a harsh truth. History remembers kings, bishops, and protocol, but it rarely remembers the women whose bodies and dignity made those histories possible. In the courts of medieval and early modern Europe, the royal bedchamber was never quiet for long. Whispers leaked through velvet curtains faster than any official decree. A single rumor, a missing stain, a limp performance, an unconvincing witness could detonate across kingdoms, unraveling alliances and staining reputations more permanently than any ink. Scandal was both entertainment and weapon, and the royal bed was its stage. The public bedding ceremony, once framed as sacred ritual, often spiraled into political farce. Courtiers, servants, and diplomats swarmed around the royal couple like flies around a feast, eager to catch a glimpse or fabricate a detail. They watched, listened, and afterward lied. The slightest ambiguity became proof of disaster. Did the king seem pale afterward? Did the queen blush too deeply? Was the chambermaid seen changing the sheets too quickly? Each observation could spark a wildfire of speculation, and in a world where legitimacy rested on consummation, gossip had the power to make or break monarchs. Few scandals illustrate this better than the case of Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves in 1540. After their wedding, Henry declared that he liked her not, complaining that her body repelled him and that the marriage was never consummated. Within months, the union was annulled on grounds of non-performance. The humiliation was twofold. Anne's virtue became a matter of public debate, while Henry's impotence was whispered across Europe's courts. Behind the polite language of incompatibility lay the ugly truth of royal scandal, the failure of the bed to produce evidence. In France, too, gossip thrived like mold on velvet. When Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette failed to consummate their marriage for 7 years, pamphlets circulated mocking the young king's awkwardness. "The queen sleeps alone," one anonymous writer quipped, "and France waits for heirs." Diplomats fretted, priests offered advice, and physicians penned entire treatises on royal anatomy. What should have been private struggle became international embarrassment, amplified by the voyeurism of the age. Even in royal silence, the bed spoke volumes. The anatomy of scandal was always the same: rumor, investigation, and humiliation. Courtiers would swarm to confirm or deny the gossip, physicians would conduct humiliating verifications, and poets would immortalize the disgrace in verse. Once the story left the bedchamber, it could never be recalled. The sheets, the witnesses, the rumors, all became instruments of propaganda. Enemies at court used them to discredit rivals. Foreign ambassadors reported them home as state intelligence. The royal bedchamber, supposedly a sanctuary, became the most dangerous place in the kingdom. For queens, scandal was a no-win game. If she bled, she was impure. If she didn't, she was unchaste. A spotless sheet could be seen as deceit, a stained one as shame. Catherine of Aragon was humiliated in court, as bishops debated whether her marriage to Arthur had been true in body. Anne Boleyn, accused of adultery, saw her private life dissected as proof of treason. In each case, the female body became evidence in a trial she could never win. The men were not immune, though their scandals were often treated as comedy rather than tragedy. Kings who failed to perform faced ridicule, but rarely ruin. Yet even they lived under constant threat of exposure. Every alliance depended on heirs, and every heir depended on a night of successful performance. To falter was to risk the collapse of kingdoms. Sexual politics was national politics, and scandal was the currency of both. Over time, the bedchamber scandal evolved from whispered rumor to printed spectacle. The rise of pamphlets and broadsheets in the 17th century turned royal gossip into public entertainment. The people who once gathered in cathedrals to bless royal beds now gathered in taverns to mock their occupants. Privacy, once merely fragile, became impossible. The royal body watched, judged, and dissected remained forever public property. The scandal in the bedchamber revealed the hypocrisy at the heart of monarchy. The same rulers who preached virtue lived in systems that demanded surveillance, suspicion, and humiliation. Behind the pomp and prayer, every crown was held together by rumor. Every dynasty owed its legitimacy to what could or could not be proven in a single night. And so, the royal bed became more than a site of pleasure or power. It was a courtroom, a confession booth, and a gallows. In its silken shadows, reputations died quietly, while the world outside feasted on their remains. By the late 17th century, Europe's obsession with verifying a bride's virginity, a practice that had dominated courts for centuries, began to crumble under the weight of reason, medical scrutiny, and political necessity. What had once been considered a sacred duty, a performance of morality and legitimacy, was increasingly recognized as cruel, unreliable, and at times absurd. The ritual of the virgin test had long served monarchs and states. A bride's chastity was seen as evidence of her moral integrity and a guarantee that heirs were legitimate. Yet the methods employed, often invasive, humiliating, and medically dubious, ensured that these examinations frequently failed in both accuracy and decency. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, courts across Europe treated virginity as a commodity. Physicians, clergy, and courtiers alike were charged with examining brides, sometimes even before the marriage itself. Observations were recorded, reports circulated, and rumors spread with devastating consequences. Mistakes were common. A natural anatomical variation, menstrual irregularity, or minor wound could be misinterpreted as evidence of sexual activity. Entire dynasties' reputations hinged on the flimsiest observations, leaving young women exposed to scandal, public humiliation, and political manipulation. One misdiagnosis could delay a marriage, endanger alliances, or provoke civil unrest. A striking example occurred in early 16th century Italy, where a young duchess was publicly declared impure by a court physician. Despite her innocence, the verdict halted her marriage and cast suspicion on her honor. Only months later was it confirmed that she had been a virgin all along, but the stigma endured. The court offered no restitution. Her body, politicized and scrutinized, remained a sight of shame. Cases like these, repeated across Europe, slowly undermined confidence in the examinations. Observers began to question the validity of an inspection, whose conclusions were so often arbitrary and harmful. The decline of the virgin test accelerated as medical knowledge advanced and rationalist thought gained influence. Enlightenment scholars and physicians increasingly argued that virginity could not be empirically proven, and that attempts to do so were both futile and ethically indefensible. Scientific discourse challenged centuries of superstition, exposing the ritual for what it was, a tool of control cloaked in the language of morality and faith. Women's private bodies, once instruments of political legitimacy, began to reclaim a measure of autonomy. Political pragmatism also contributed to the ritual's demise. Marriages among royalty and nobility had become instruments of diplomacy, designed to forge alliances rather than simply secure dynastic purity. Monarchs realized that public examinations often created scandal rather than assurance, undermining the very legitimacy they were meant to protect. Private contracts, witnesses' affidavits, and clerical certification increasingly replaced invasive procedures. The royal bed, once a stage for observation, became discreet, and examinations shifted toward verifiable matters such as health and fertility, rather than sexual history. By the 18th century, legal reforms and church decrees formalized the abandonment of virgin inspections. Physicians withdrew from their intrusive role in matrimonial politics, while ecclesiastical authorities emphasized consent, documentation, and discretion. Public spectacle no longer dictated legitimacy. Instead, marriage and inheritance were regulated by evidence and procedure. The body, long politicized, began to regain privacy. Yet the death of the virgin test left a lingering cultural imprint. Social expectations of female chastity persisted, and centuries of surveillance had imprinted deep anxieties and gendered norms that endured well beyond the ritual's formal end. Literature, law, and moral instruction continued to reflect the legacy of control over women's bodies, even as Enlightenment rationality began to prevail. Ultimately, the demise of the virgin test marked a profound societal shift. Authority gradually moved from spectacle and coercion toward reason, discretion, and bureaucratic oversight. The intimate, once a matter of public verification, became increasingly private. For the first time, legitimacy no longer demanded a public performance of purity. The royal bed, though still symbolic, no longer required witnesses to validate virtue, and women's bodies slowly escaped their role as instruments of political evidence. The death of the virgin test was neither dramatic nor immediate. It was quiet, bureaucratic, and incomplete, but it symbolized the end of an era in which chastity was public currency, humiliation masqueraded as holiness, and the intimate was inseparable from statecraft. The story of the royal bride, scrutinized by physicians, courtiers, and clergy, did not end with the death of the virgin test. In fact, the practices of the past cast a long shadow over European society, embedding a legacy of control that extended far beyond palaces, courts, and ceremonial beds. For centuries, women's bodies had been politicized, moralized, and surveilled, and the echoes of this scrutiny lingered long after public inspections became obsolete. The legacy of control was subtle, systemic, and in many ways institutionalized, woven into law, social expectation, and the very fabric of European cultural consciousness. At the heart of this legacy was the idea that female bodies were public property. Queens, princesses, and noblewomen were treated as political instruments. Their virginity, fertility, and obedience were scrutinized, documented, and verified to ensure dynastic continuity. Even after the 18th century, when the formal rituals of verification faded, society continued to police women's behavior. Morality became codified. Women were expected to embody virtue, modesty, and decorum at all times, under the watchful eyes of family, community, and state. A misstep, real or imagined, could ruin reputations, impede marriages, or spark scandal. Control had migrated from ceremonial inspection to social surveillance, perpetuated by gossip, literature, and legal structures. The legal system itself bore traces of the old oversight. Marriage laws emphasized the bride's consent, purity, and comportment, often framing her body and behavior as a matter of public concern. Dowries, contracts, and ecclesiastical approvals all served as mechanisms to regulate women's sexuality and ensure that inheritance and alliances proceeded according to established norms. Even as the courts refrained from invasive examinations, written documentation and witnesses substituted for direct observation, preserving the principle that women's bodies and their supposed virtue were instruments of legitimacy. Education and literature reinforced these norms. Conduct manuals, moral treatises, and popular texts instructed women in the art of obedience, modesty, and self-restraint. The lessons were clear. Autonomy was secondary, and the consequences of deviation were social, economic, and personal ruin. In subtle ways, the surveillance of the past continued to dictate behavior, shaping aspirations, marriages, and reputations for generations. What had been a spectacle of public humiliation became an internalized vigilance, a mental, social, and cultural form of control. The political dimension persisted as well. Monarchs and states continued to view women's reproductive capacity as central to dynastic and national stability. Royal marriages were still calculated for alliances, legitimacy, and inheritance, even if the rituals had changed. Physicians no longer performed invasive inspections, but medical authority, advice, and interventions maintained influence over fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth. The body remained a site of political interest, even in the absence of formal ceremonies. Modern society, in many ways, inherited these legacies. The obsession with female purity, public judgment of private behavior, and policing of women's sexuality, though transformed, can trace a direct line back to these medieval and early modern practices. Social norms, media scrutiny, and cultural expectations continue to impose standards shaped by centuries of surveillance and control. Even as laws and institutions evolved, the echoes of the royal bed, the courtly gaze, and the ecclesiastical oversight remained embedded in the ways societies monitor and define female behavior. Yet the legacy is not only oppressive, it is instructive. By understanding the historical mechanisms of control, modern observers can recognize patterns of surveillance, politicization, and gendered power. The lessons of the past illuminate how power operates, how societal expectations are constructed, and how rituals once framed as divine or necessary can become instruments of domination. Ultimately, the story of the bride examined by the entire court before her wedding is more than a historical curiosity. It is a cautionary tale about the intersection of power, gender, and spectacle, and about how control can survive long after the original rituals have ended. The royal bed may have been dismantled, the virgin tests abolished, and public examinations outlawed, but the principles they embodied, surveillance, judgment, and the politicization of the intimate, endure in subtler, yet no less powerful, forms. The legacy of control is both enduring and pervasive, a reminder that the private has always been public, that authority shapes bodies as well as laws, and that the intimate is often inseparable from power. Europe may have left the courts of humiliation behind, but the echoes of those beds, gowns, and rituals continue to inform the ways society measures, monitors, and commands.